The applause was warm and genuine, especially from the older viewers, who saw in him echoes of his father's charisma. Jimmy Kimmel, seated behind his desk, flashed his signature smile, his tie slightly loosened, exuding the polished charm of a host who had balanced the tightrope of late-night television for decades. The show began in its usual rhythm. Jimmy's monologue, a few jabs at the week's political oddities, and a light-hearted skit about Los Angeles traffic that drew laughter from the crowd. When Scott settled into the guest chair, the atmosphere was convivial, the hum of the air conditioning barely audible beneath the chuckles. Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and started with a simple question about Scott's recent role in a Western reboot, a nod to his father's iconic career. Scott's responses were measured, his voice low and steady, sharing stories about working with veteran stunt coordinators and the challenges of stepping out from under Clint Eastwood's shadow. The older audience listened intently, nodding at mentions of Unforgiven and the good, the bad, and the ugly, their faces glowing with the warmth of shared cinematic memories. Jimmy's questions were initially light, touching on Scott's experiences on film sets as a child, the weight of his last name, and whether Clint ever offered acting advice over dinner. But as the conversation shifted to Hollywood's role in shaping public sentiment, particularly around delicate issues of racial representation in film, a faint edge crept into Jimmy's voice, his smile less sincere, as if he were priming the stage for something more. Scott, sensing the change in tone, tilted his head slightly, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest, his gaze sharpening. Jimmy pulled out a tablet, its screen displaying a 2023 X post from Scott supporting free speech in Hollywood, commenting on a controversy about an actor canceled over a tweet. The post had sparked a firestorm, with thousands of reposts and accusations of Scott endorsing divisive views. The audience fell silent, sensing the tension, their plastic cups no longer crinkling. Scott's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as Jimmy read an excerpt from the post, asking if Scott thought his stance seemed like a defense of outdated views. Scott responded evenly, explaining that his words were about free expression, not specific political positions, but his voice carried a faint tremor of restrained frustration. Jimmy pressed on, revealing a leaked 2024 email from a show producer discussing plans to ask edgy questions of guests with conservative leanings to boost ratings. The audience began to murmur, older viewers exchanging glances, recalling an era when television was about entertainment, not confrontation. Scott leaned forward, his fingers gripping the armrest tighter, his eyes narrowing as he directly asked Jimmy if the show deliberately set traps for guests to generate viral content. The studio's tension was palpable, the scent of sweat mixing with coffee, the air conditioner's hum louder in the silence. Jimmy, whose smile now seemed forced, brushed it off, calling it just a conversation, but his fingers nervously tapped the desk. The audience split. Some clapped in support of Scott, others quietly scrolled X on their phones, already capturing the moment. Scott pulled out his phone, showing a screenshot of a 2024 Variety article criticizing Jimmy Kimmel Live for manipulative editing of interviews to push a liberal narrative and accused Jimmy of double standards. The audience gasped, cameras whirred, and producers offstage signaled to wrap the segment, but the tension had reached a boiling point. Scott stood abruptly, his movements smooth but resolute as he began removing his microphone, his face a mix of frustration and dignity. Jimmy, his voice trembling with panic, tried to diffuse the situation with a joke, but his words fell flat in the silent studio. Scott paused at the stage's edge, his figure seeming taller than it was, and turned back to cast a final look at Jimmy, not angry, but laced with quiet contempt that resonated with the older audience who valued his father's stoicism. He walked off, leaving the studio in stunned silence, only the faint click of cameras and the crowd's whispers breaking the hush. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Jimmy's pale face as he tried to move to the next segment, but his voice was weak, his smile fragile. As the show cut to commercial, X erupted with posts. One from at Hollywood Truth 2025, with 12,000 reposts, called Scott a victim of Kimmel's trap. Another from at Justice Wave, with 9,000 likes, accused him of dodging accountability for past views. A Hollywood Reporter article, published an hour later, quoted sources saying the show's producers were furious over the loss of control, while Scott's team claimed he was unprepared for the ambush. The older audience, especially those over 55, felt a mix of emotions. Anger at the loss of late-night TV's charm as an escape from reality, shame over the public spat, and empathy for Scott, who they felt had stood up for dignity. Meanwhile, younger X-users split into camps, some calling Scott a hypocrite, others praising his resistance to media manipulation. Amid the noise, a post from @BridgeBuilder LA, a local activist, gained 600 reposts. Scott and Jimmy aren't enemies, they're us, arguing without listening. Maybe it's time to listen. The post, modest in reach, struck a chord, hinting that even this messy confrontation could spark real dialogue. As the studio lights dimmed and the crowd spilled into the Los Angeles night, the city's hum, car horns and distant noise, echoed the chaotic yet necessary moment that had just unfolded, leaving more questions than answers. 2 days later, the internet exploded when an interview with Clint Eastwood, recorded for a cinema-focused podcast, surfaced online, addressing the episode involving his son on Jimmy Kimmel's show. In the recording studio, the air smelled of old wood and dust, and Clint's gravelly, measured voice cut through the silence as he defended Scott with a quiet but unwavering strength. His weathered face, etched with lines, held the same resolve that made him a legend as he spoke of Scott's efforts to carve his own path without leaning on the Eastwood name. Clint sharply criticized Jimmy Kimmel, accusing him of using guests as pawns for ratings rather than treating them as people with their own stories. He referenced a 2023 Hollywood Reporter article exposing the show's practice of booking guests for provocative segments and quoted an X post from an anonymous insider claiming Kimmel's team deliberately chased hot topics for viral moments. Clint, seated in a leather chair, his fingers tightly gripping the armrests, emphasized that Scott came to the show with an open heart, ready for conversation, but was met with a trap meant to humiliate. His words, though restrained, carried an anger that resonated with older audiences who saw him as a symbol of an era when respect was the foundation of interaction. The interview went viral, amassing 20,000 reposts on X within hours, with the hashtag #EastwoodVsKimmel trending at the top. A post from @CinemaLegacy with 15,000 likes praised Clint for defending his son, calling him Hollywood's last true voice, while @Media Watchdog accused Clint of hypocrisy, citing his own controversial political remarks from 2016. The public reaction deepened the polarization. Some rooted for Scott and Clint, seeing them as defenders of dignity, while others deemed them out of touch, accusing them of sidestepping tough issues. Within hours of Clint's interview, Jimmy Kimmel posted an official statement on X, which spread rapidly, garnering 25,000 reposts. Written in a measured but earnest tone, he apologized to the audience and Scott Eastwood, admitting that his questions may have come across as overly aggressive. In an empty studio after another taping, where the scent of coffee mixed with a faint whiff of sanitizer, Jimmy, his shoulders slightly hunched and eyes weary from a sleepless night, recorded a brief video accompanying his post. In it, he explained that his intent was to spark an open conversation about complex issues, but he acknowledged that his tone and approach were missteps, especially toward a guest who deserved respect. His voice trembled with uncharacteristic vulnerability as he addressed the older audience, mentioning how he grew up on Clint Eastwood's films and regretted that the conversation overshadowed a legacy of respect he aimed to uphold. The response to his apology was mixed. A post from @TV Insider with 10,000 reposts called Jimmy's apology belated but necessary, while @Culture Critic with 8,000 likes labeled it a damage control attempt under pressure. The older audience, valuing stoicism and dignity, felt torn. Some saw the apology as a sincere step, recalling an era when public mistakes were openly acknowledged, while others viewed it as a forced gesture in response to Clint's wrath. In Los Angeles, as the studio lights dimmed and the city buzzed with car horns and distant noise, a modest post on X from @LA Listener, gaining just 500 reposts, offered a quiet reflection. Scott, Clint, Jimmy, they're all flawed, but an apology is a start. Maybe listening to each other is the way forward. Lost in the clamor, the post carried a faint glimmer of hope that even in a fractured world, honesty and dialogue could pave a path to understanding if someone dared to take the first step.